Hey everybody, it's Lucille Isadora Therese. I am here with an exciting new video for those of you who like in-depth content. So this is over an hour long. It's going to get deep into a rationale for a new Christian mystical theological model. We're going to start with what the problem with the traditional theological model is, what the alternatives are, and then dive into this new model, which includes the evolution of human consciousness described vibrationally. So that is the full content. I'm also going to chop it up into smaller bits. So if you're just interested in learning about the model itself without the rationale for creating it and the process, then you can watch that separate video, which will also be on our channel list. So if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos. And I look forward to hearing what you got out of the video in the comment section. I'm always interested in people's experience of these things and what they're getting out of it and how they're using it, or what earnest questions you have. So if you have any of those, put them in the comments section and I will get back to as many people as I can. Thanks, and excuse me, I hope you love it. Okay, here we go. I'm recording while getting over a cold, so I want you to forgive me for coughing and or smacking my lips unintentionally. So I ask your forgiveness on the front end for the imperfection of this recording. So this is a new unified model of Christian mystical theology by Lucille Isadora Therese, 2019. This model answers the following questions. What is the purpose of human existence? What is the cause of human suffering? Why are human beings capable of the most horrible atrocities and at the same time capable of the most beautiful and selfless love? And lastly, can we integrate spiritual beliefs and practice with modern science? So there are some big problems with the traditional Christian model, and I want to do a little caveat here. If you're listening or watching this and you believe that the traditional Christian theology is a literal representation of the creation of human beings, the planet, and of God, then I promise you, you'll hate this presentation and find it horribly disrespectful and blasphemous. So I respect your right to your own beliefs, but I promise you we will not change each other's minds about these things. So let's just go our separate ways here. I don't recommend watching the rest of it. And if you do want to watch it, know that it's going to piss you off, and you don't need to express that anger in my comment section because I already know that you're very certain that I'm wrong about this. And we're not going to change each other's minds. So let's move on. Okay, I want to preface this by saying I'm doing this a little tongue-in-cheek, not because I'm being disrespectful. I believe in the value of Scripture. I think that we're better when we can sort of embrace some of the absurdity of it and not take ourselves too seriously. So I'm not making fun of anyone in this. I hopefully am expressing a kind of irreverence to even my own belief system. So Old Testament wise, first there was an old white-ish guy who was God. The Old Testament paints a picture of God that is a lot like a human guy, but much more powerful and maybe sometimes morally better. So what kind of God is this guy? Omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. So for those of you who don't know, omniscient means all-knowing, omnipotent means all-powerful, and omnipresent means everywhere, in all places at once. So the description in classical theology of God is that God has these three qualities, which means God knows, omniscient, God knows everything, everything, including outside of time and space limitations. So God knows what's going to happen as well as what has happened, and has knowledge of all thoughts, all behaviors, everything that is existing, every cell, every microbe, all things at all times. The omnipotent means all powerful, and that means that there's no limitation to the power of God. And omnipresent means all places at all times. So let's break that down in the next slide. Let's get into the origin story. The story of Eden is the traditional Judeo-Christian explanation for the suffering of human beings, right? Why do people suffer? Because original sin that especially is emphasized in the Roman Catholic tradition, but it's sort of part of almost all Christian denominations, which is that we're kind of prone to or destined for evil in some ways because we're tainted by the behavior of Adam and Eve. This is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, which is the source of the original sin, which we started talking about. So, as you probably know, God created the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. The story of Adam and Eve's creation is actually told two different ways in the Old Testament in Genesis. The first way is that Adam and Eve are both made out of dust and then breathed life into, or mud, whichever way you want to call that. And then the other one is that Adam is made first, and then Eve is created out of part of Adam. But what's important to know about this, just as a side note, is that the word Adam isn't actually a male name. It means human, and it's gender neutral to start with. So the way that the genders are used in the beginning is that there's like a non-gendered human who's then split into two genders. Not that there was a man and then made a woman. So anyways, God tells them, hey, there's all this beauty here. There's trees, there's food, there's animals to name and to be around. And the only thing you're not allowed to do is eat from the tree of good and evil. And if you obey that, all will be good. So Adam and Eve are happy until Eve first eats of the tree and then offers it to Adam, and then they both have knowledge of good and evil, and this brings a sense of shame. God punishes them by kicking them out of the garden and blocking access to the tree of life, which is the other tree in Eden. And they go out and they begin to suffer. Eve primarily through childbirth, and Adam primarily through toiling in the soil. So that's the stories. Then we suffer because they broke the rules. Wait, so God made us this way on purpose, even though most of us fail? So we're going to get into this next slide, but here's the first sort of glitch in this story is if Adam and Eve were created by God, who has perfect knowledge, including outside of time and space, then we'd have to assume that God knew exactly how it was going to go, right? So not only could God have made Adam and Eve anyway, with any capacities or propensities, but also God would know ahead of time how that would go. So to accept this, we have to assume that God knew that they were going to eat of the tree and made them in a way that they were prone to that decision, and then punished them for the decision that they were designed to make at some level, right? There's a question of free will, right? But this is not like just that they might have made that choice. God knows they will make that choice, and therefore has chosen not to make them in a way they're not likely to make that choice, right? So this becomes a problem right in the beginning of the story. So then this understanding of punishment and reward is continued in a more full idea of this forever punishment and forever reward in the concepts of heaven and hell. So the concepts of heaven and hell as we know them are not exactly biblical, though. They're actually a kind of extrapolation from a lot of ambiguous references to good places and bad places in the Bible. But there is no place in the Bible, New Testament or Old Testament, where these various images are connected together and then connected directly to the concept of afterlife. So there's bits and pieces of punishment and reward, and there's bits and pieces of connection to after you die, but there's really no place where it's like you die and then you go to either a good place or a bad place, either eternal reward or eternal punishment. That's not really there. It's kind of been all pulled together into this theological model that was mostly invented by the Catholic Church. So the problem with heaven and hell, one is that eternity is a really long time. And this presents a time scale issue as far as if there is one life and then your eternal abode is determined by your behavior in that one life, then the difference in time between a single life and eternity is so huge that it presents this issue, and we're going to frame it in the next. So there are 2.6 billion seconds in 85 years. It's a bigger, more specific number than that, but we'll go with 2.6 billion. Eternity is definitely much longer than 2.6 billion years. But to make the math simple, if we scale each year down to a second and a lifetime lasts 85 years, then we have about 2.6 billion seconds in a lifetime. So for our eternal abode to be determined by a single human lifetime would be like determining whether you would have total joy or constant torture for your whole life based on what you were doing, thinking, or feeling in one random second of your life. If you were being petty, mean, or selfish in that second, then you will be tortured for your whole life. If you were being helpful, loving, kind, or selfless in that second, you will have bliss for your whole life. If you were doing something neutral, like brushing your teeth and thinking about what you ate last night, you'll go to purgatory until you realize it was selfish to be thinking about dinner while so many people are going hungry, or something like that. So you get a sense, right, that this is a timescale problem. It seems kind of crazy to base an entire life on one particular second, and especially when the consequences are so high, right? When the consequences are either torture or perfect joy. And a one lifetime model is always going to have that issue if heaven and hell are involved. Okay, so this is now the extension of the Adam and Eve problem, which is that what kind of God is this guy? This presents the issue of a loving God that creates a plan and all the people in it, the plan being Adam and Eve, and then passing Adam and Eve's guilt and suffering onto all of humankind for some reason. That's something that's never explained. Why are all human beings punished for the decisions of Adam and Eve? Who knows? It seems not nice, not fair. And then with full knowledge of the outcome, which is that most people suffer greatly on earth and then are sent to be eternally tortured in hell. So we don't know what the numbers are. No one's ever come up with the numbers, right? How much of human beings go to hell, how much of human beings go to heaven. But according to most churches, a lot of people go to hell. So that means that the plan is either failing or God wants to send most people to be eternally tortured. Which then goes, what kind of God is that then? Literally, right? Okay, so that brings up the question of, like, are we talking about these things literally? There's a lot of different levels of options around how literal we're taking this. Are we literally talking about a human being, Adam and Eve, who lived in a literal garden called Eden and ate a literal apple, so on and so forth, and they are the progenitors of the whole human race? That's one level of literal, which, as I said in the beginning, if that's one's belief, we really have almost no overlap. Oh, excuse me with coughing. Okay, so, but even if we're not taking it literal like that, what do we make of these things? I mean, is there literally heaven and hell? If not, what happens after you die? Then the question's just not answered. You know, are we supposed to take these stories about how God behaves and the decision that God makes as literal enough to represent something about the personality or behavior of God? So we have these two options. Either we're sort of working with it very literally, in which case there's tons of problems. And we're working with it kind of literally, and then there's a bunch of unanswered questions, right? So then we need a model. We need something to work with, like, how do we take these things and what do they mean? And if they don't mean what we've been taught they mean, then what do they mean? So it's my supposition that these kinds of theological holes, combined with a historical pattern of religion being used as a tool of hate, oppression, and abuse, is probably a big part of why so many people have ditched the institution of Christianity and many other religions in the last 100 years. Right? We have a couple of big problems that are probably responsible for a lot of the exodus out of organized religion, especially in the United States. One is that we have science to explain sort of why physical stuff happens, which religion used to be responsible for explaining those things, you know. Why rain, why storms, why floods, those kind of things. We have an understanding of the history of religion, which includes a ginormous amount of atrocity and oppression. And we have a split where Christianity in the United States was really claimed and possessed by the extreme right. So then there's a lot of sense of to be Christian means to be born-again fundamentalist, right-wing Christian. And so these things sort of have all come together, and a lot of people are exiting organized religion, which is understandable. So why not just ditch the whole thing? Okay, well, we can, and people do all the time. But what are the alternatives? In fact, the fact is we're biologically built for belief. Human beings universally seek meaning in some kind of transcendent context for their experience and their existence. This is a fact. Over and over again, all throughout history, the entire course of written history is full of people doing this. People consistently create some sort of religious or spiritual context. They create understandings and mythology about God, about the creation of the planet, about why things happen, about what our purpose is, right? We seem to need some sort of meaning context. So if religion has all these problems, then is atheism or humanism, secular humanism, and or science the answer? Well, they're reasonable answers, and they're satisfying to some people. But if we're going that route, then I think we need to be honest about what it means. I think a lot of times it's easy to ditch religion and spirituality and not be honest about what we're replacing it with, or actually pretend like we're not replacing it when we really are replacing it. So let's talk about atheism and science. So according to atheism and mainstream science, there's likely nothing beyond the physical. There is no purpose to human existence except to perpetuate human existence. Basically, we're here to make more of us. We have just a biological drive to procreate, and everything else is secondary to that. There is no essential morality, only socially constructed ones. We suffer mostly because we are afflicted with an evolutionary advantage that also causes us to create a great deal of emotional misery for ourselves and others, and that's a brain problem, right? So according to science currently, the idea is that we developed this capacity for imagination, essentially, that we can project ourselves into an imagined future and then sort out how things might go. Now, this gave us the idea, the mental capacity to solve complex problems, to be able to think ahead and plan ahead, which allows for these complex civilizations, philosophy, and all that stuff, right? So the problem is that it also makes us prone to feeling like the things that we imagine are real, and therefore we become anxious or depressed when we imagine the future, or we obsess about the past, which animals separate from human beings don't tend to do. So essentially, we have this evolutionary advantage, which also causes this problem, and our suffering has no meaning or purpose. So when you die, it may have subjective meaning to some people for a few more decades past your life, but then your existence means nothing. Even if you contribute to something lasting to society, the fact is, if it wasn't you, it likely would have been someone else that contributed it. And you're not around to enjoy the fact that you've left a legacy. So nothing you do actually matters for very long. That's the reality. And I think to really claim atheism would be self-responsible and honest to really deeply accept that and be with that and work with that. I really respect an atheist who is facing the existential crisis that atheism creates. Not just going, yeah, okay, it means nothing, so what? Because if we really believe that, then we'd live in a really different way. If none of it matters, mostly we would not live the way we live, because we spend a lot of time and energy doing stuff that has no pleasure value, and in which there is no other purpose for doing except that it matters somehow. So there's something more. I mean, I could talk a lot more about that, but let's move on to the next slide. Okay, let's talk about secular humanism. Secular humanism is nice. It suggests that there's some intrinsic value to being kind and helpful to other human beings and sometimes certain animals. We're very confused about that as a society, whether animals matter or don't matter, and whether torturing them matters or doesn't matter. Often we're very offended by a dog being kicked, but we're okay with tons of animals being tortured for our food. All right, so we have mixed stuff about that. So again, we feel like there's some value, even if there's no clear explanation as to why we should, other than the fact that it might make life less painful for some of us. But if you believe the current scientific theories, then you also have to accept that the whole impulse to be altruistic is probably just the consequence of a reward system built into our brains to encourage pro-social behavior, so more of our children survive long enough to spread their DNA, which is our DNA. So maybe we're just kind of being nice to other people in order to get a little high off some natural brain chemicals. Now, yeah, I mean, secular humanism should be embracing science, right? So that's the current science. Science is not, scientific theories are in flux often. So maybe there's something beyond that. But generally, the mainstream belief is that we tend to do pro-social stuff. We tend to build societies and groups and stay in families because it has the best chance of survival for our offspring. So if that's true, then all the feelings that we get from being pro-social, all the feelings we get from being nice to each other and building parks and trying to make better political systems and helping the poor and all that stuff, it maybe has value, but you can really, if you're going to be a reductionist about it, it all comes down to sort of getting higher on our own brain chemicals. Again, if we can radically accept that, then good for you, like that you can live with the full reality of your own beliefs, then I totally respect that, and that's an option. Another option is agnosticism, or this kind of spiritual mishmash, which a lot of people embrace in this current American culture. So there's lots of different kinds of agnostics, but I think they fall into two broad categories. One is they don't know if there's anything beyond the physical, and they really don't care. So there's that. There's just kind of a disengagement from the question itself. I mean, if you go to like the mathematician and philosopher and Christian apologist, Pascal or C.S. Lewis, they'll say that it's insane not to be concerned with this question, but I think it's one valid way to live is as a materialist, which is I don't know what else there is. I don't know why I have the impulses I have. I don't know why I care about the things I care about, but I do, and it seems fine, and so I'm disinterested in knowing more about it. The second kind is they don't know what's ultimately true, but they have some feeling about what might be true, about God or spiritual realities that are beyond the physical world. The second kind is very close to various forms of spiritual, not religious folks who have usually gathered up bits and pieces of different teachings that feel true to them. So what this is it's kind of like eschewing the whole structure of theology and religion and just kind of picking and choosing what feels good or what sounds right. Often God is replaced with universe or things that have a vague sense of meaning without having to get too specific or agree on things as a group. Okay, so the point is there's a lot of different ways to solve the sort of question of meaning and purpose and function of human beings. There's obviously a bunch of other religions, all of which have some benefits and limitations to their structure, and none of which lack a history of abuses, right? Sometimes people like to think that Buddhism is free of that, but it isn't. There's currently Buddhists in Asia who are actively slaughtering Hindus for being Hindu because they're doing the wrong religion, right? So religious strife is unavoidable. Human strife is unavoidable. So some people like to say, okay, if we got rid of all religion, then we have no war. That's clearly not true. So whether there's religion is the justification or it's not, human beings kill each other. Human beings fight. They create identities, whether it's tribal identity, clothes, religion, belief in what's the best farming practices, political beliefs, right? I mean, there's a ton of war about the fight for the ideals of communism versus democracy and capitalism, right? This is the nature of human beings at this point in our development. So there is no out to the problems, right? There is no like, oh, if I just dismiss the whole thing, all the problems of meaning and purpose go away, right? We all choose sort of how we're going to solve this problem of meaning in our lives, and that has costs and benefits. So what I'm going to present is a whole new way of understanding theology in the sort of Judeo-Christian model, and in a truly mystical form. So the reason why this model has come to be is two things. One, I believe that there is no perfect theology, but theology needs to hold together. It needs to at least be internally consistent and consistent with our experience in order to be useful to us. And it has come out of a revelation that I received in the process of meditation. So that's what we're going to talk about now. We're moving into that part of it. Like I said, why not keep a vague sense of spiritual meaning and ditch all the organized religion, theology, and spiritual structure? Well, let's talk about what the value of spiritual structure is briefly. I mean, there's two reasons why we build organized religion. One is abusive. It's basically a way to consolidate power and control people. But the other is it's a supportive community and a consistent set of practices that can lead to spiritual growth. There is something unquestionably useful about community. We're built for community. We are evolved for community. When we do things as a group, the power of those things potentially increases. Now that can be used for positive or negative ends, right? But there is a power in togetherness, in aligning our beliefs, aligning our practices, and there's a lot of power in very specific practices that have been tested. So the world religions almost all have sets of practices that are tried and true. People have done them over and over again for thousands of years and received experiences or benefits that are fairly consistent, right? That's like not reinventing the wheel. So there's something very useful about using methods that have already been found to be effective and to help you reach the growth or transformation or peace or whatever your goals are spiritually. So now we're getting into mysticism, which is sort of an unreligion, because mystics eschew dogma and most things that are associated with organized religion. So what is dogma? Dogma is like a set of beliefs that is rigid and prescriptive, like you have to believe this to be okay, to be accepted, to be part of, and it is absolutely true, unquestionably true. That's dogma. Dogma is what a lot of people associate with religion. Since most religions are defined by their dogma, mystics are usually rejected or even persecuted by the mainstream versions of their religion. So mysticism is an unreligion for a few reasons. One, because mystics are rejected often by their own religious traditions, often because they fail to adhere to or abide by a dogma. And secondly, because they don't define themselves by a set of unquestioned teachings or belief. Instead, mystics are interested in the living experience. So there could be teachings, there can be structure, and there can be tenets or models, but those are not used to replace or to force some kind of external unity among the group. Instead, they are held as useful structures that help the individual experience the ultimate reality themselves and have the wisdom from within unfold. That's the difference between mysticism and religion in general. Okay, so because this model comes from Revelation, I want to talk about what Revelation is and isn't for a minute. So spiritual revelation is the reception of a sliver of ultimate truth that has been translated into a form comprehensible to the human consciousness who received it. So ultimate truth, the big cosmic universal realities, are so huge and expansive that they are impossible for the human consciousness to fully comprehend, right? So then we get these slivers in Revelation, and they're translated through the being that received them. For people who are invested in spiritual transformation and development, especially mystics, one of the goals is to become a less and less obstructed vessel, which means that when things come through, they have a capacity to come through more universally and less idiosyncratically personally. So the issues with Revelation are when something comes through idiosyncratically, means it's just made for your understanding at the time, and then it's tried to be applied as if it's universal. And then people end up doing these kind of heavy-handed dogmatic things with Revelation. That's not how we do. That's not how I roll, at least. Okay, so from my perspective, spiritual revelation cannot be perfect unless the vehicle that receives it is perfect. And since a perfect vessel would have no need for revelation, as it would already be unified with the ultimate truth, we can assume that all revelation is imperfect to some degree. But it also carries a vibrational level or energetic signature or reality, whatever you want to call it, that has the capacity to transform human consciousness to some degree. And that is a kind of magic, a really important kind of mystical magic, where the ultimate truth, like slivers of ultimate truth, universal truth, have the capacity to ignite and transform human consciousness, to help evolve human consciousness. And so it matters and it's important. So all human beings are capable of spiritual revelation. It is not something that only certain human beings are capable of. The goal of mystical work often, in the short term or in the midterm, is that we want to get better at sort of releasing egoic attachments and identities that then make revelations more idiosyncratic. So we want to get better at being a sort of more universal vehicle and less personal vehicle. That can be done, and it is worthy work in a mystical path. It's a lot of work because we're working towards more and more union with that ultimate source. The big problem with revelation historically is that human beings take something idiosyncratic and try to apply it as if it's universal, and that ends up becoming a sort of dogmatic, heavy-handed, or self-aggrandizing situation. So, revelation it happens a lot. I mean, people get inspirations a lot. I think anybody who has a committed spiritual life is getting some bits of revelation, and lots of people who don't have a committed spiritual life, they just, like, sometimes something in nature or something that's inspiring, it like communicates a little piece of revelation. That's not hard. Most people cannot differentiate, however, between those things which are divinely inspired in themselves and those which are concocted and contaminated by their egoic minds. So it is this kind of mishmash of egoic and divine that makes a lot of problems, and the inability to differentiate between the two. So what we're going to try to do, what this model does, is it uses a mystical understanding of the Bible and then brings in a new model of human development. So mystics value the communication of higher states of reality in all forms. They value revelation. There is a reason that these books and these stories continue to move people and transform people, even though they're thousands of years old and in a lot of ways culturally bound. They contain revelations that hold powerful, energetic transmissions, important symbols, and stories. So there is something alive. There's real living revelation in the Old Testament, and even more so in the New Testament from my experience. And this vitality, this like living revelation, has this capacity to move people and open people. Now, what they do with that and how they apply that is obviously hugely varied, but this is why Scripture still matters. This is why we still use Scripture and we engage with Scripture in a mystical way. So ultimately, all models of God and the ultimate spiritual realities are wrong and will always be wrong to some degree, okay? No human model can capture God, ultimate God. So that's just a basic logic, which is that something that is limited cannot contain something unlimited. So a model is a way of translating the untranslatable. There will never be a perfect model, but there can be inspired, useful, and cohesive ones. And the cohesive part is very important to me personally. That's what I received, and that's what I'm offering. So now we're going to get into that. Now, this next piece is also going to be a standalone video, so I may restate a few things to keep it in context. So this is a model. It's a mystical Judeo-Christian model of theology and human purpose and meaning. So the way I've defined it is this phrase. I'm going to break it down so that it's very accessible. So this is the vibration evolution of human consciousness model is an inclusive, unified, alternative model for Christian mystical theology. Inclusive, what does that mean? It means that this model includes and values the traditional scriptural sources. Unified means that this model integrates many previous models, including traditional exoteric, which means external. That's more like traditional religion, Christianity, neuropsychology, human development, esoteric, which is the more mystical, internal, and hermetic wisdom and spiritual revelation. So it's unified in that it brings all these things together. It's alternative in the sense that this model is an alternative to traditional exoteric Christian theology. Lastly, it's Christian mystical theology. It's a model intended to be applied by those who seek spiritual development through mystical paths. It's framed within a Judeo-Christian theology, but it can be applied to any religion, and it's actually easily adapted to secular humanist framework as well, if that's your jam. So a revelation and a perspective shift. So if we take this Adam and Eve question again, this is how it unfolded for me. I was meditating on the Adam and Eve story, and was asking in meditation these questions about what it means. You know, I had been reading some inspired work that was talking about original sin and about transforming the sin of Adam and Eve, and I had a sense of disquiet and some things just not fitting energetically, metaphysically, you know, it was not a cohesiveness to this idea. And so I was trying to reconcile my experience and understanding of a loving God, not only just a loving God, but a God that is love, with a story like Adam and Eve in which there is this punishment. And also a bigger question about sort of the beginning of the evolution of human consciousness. And so what I received in that first meditation was that the story of Adam and Eve was a narrator, a sort of a narration problem as well. From whose point of view was the story told? And so the question was, what if you shift the narrator from a divine perspective to a human one? So the story is told like from the omniscient point of view, from like sort of like God's point of view of what happened, right? But if you shift it to a human understanding, and then the human perspective is like a child's perspective. It can be littered with misunderstanding and still have meaning. So what if the story of Adam and Eve is really the story of what it felt like to enter into the physical plane from the spiritual plane for the first time? So then I was sitting with that, right? That's really profound. Okay, so human beings, souls, you know, the divine part, is first moving from this high vibrational reality, this God unity experience, into a physical experience. There are two things that happen, right? First is a sense of falling, which we're going to get to. It's a very common theme in mystical stories and various religious stories, a sense of falling from a higher place to a lower place, from something beautiful to something difficult, right? So the sense of fall. And then there's like, how do you make sense of that fall? What happened? Now, if you apply a dense consciousness, you know, a lower vibrational consciousness, to try to understand that egoic consciousness, what happened? Why do you lose something wonderful? The lower consciousness answer that is punishment, right? It was a punishment. You had something good and you lost it because you were bad. And so then the whole story is framed in that misunderstanding, that this coming into a lower vibration was a punishment for misbehavior. Now I'm going to offer you the alternative here in the next slides. Again, to recap on the fall, the idea of a kind of fall from heavenly divine state into a dense human state is a theme in many forms of mysticism because it resonates with a soul level felt sense. We feel it. We still feel it. Most people, and if they get into exploration of their spiritual selves, they can access this feeling of loss, of falling. We know intuitively that once we had an experience of union and life, and then we lost it somehow. This is the experience of a fall from a higher vibration to a lower one. Now the influence of the lower vibrational states makes us interpret that experience as punishment. Thus, the story of Adam and Eve cites sin and punishment as the cause for the fall. So here's alternative. Here's alternative narration, story, model, myth for the beginning. And I say myth not to say that it's not true, but it is a way of understanding it. It is not ultimate truth because we're not there and being able to understand that. But intuitively and from a deep meditative mystical experience, it's much closer to the truth in my experience. So this is called the love story of creation. Out of a great outpouring of God's love nature, the Creator God spoke the word of creation that began the universe. The universe is unfolding exactly as God intended. At the perfect moment in the unfolding of the universe, human souls were made in the likeness of God. Each was granted a perfect cell of God at the center of their eternal beings. They were endowed with free will and designed to develop into radiant God beings. We were provided Earth's dense vibrational state so that we might experience a separate sense of self in order to develop a full understanding of the power of free will. We are destined to come to understand the truth of our nature and rejoin our Creator in a perfect unity of love. Every vibrational level is perfectly designed to support our evolution. Every way of learning is good. Every lesson matters. Every level takes exactly as long as we need it to, and every state is part of God's perfect plan. Now, when I say God's perfect plan, it's easy to fall back into the traditional model of thinking about God like a big man person. That's not what I'm talking about. At this level, now there are levels of God, there are levels of reality that are more or less personal, but at this level, we're talking about a universal God. So there is an evolutionary impulse that begins creation from the nature of God's being. This is not a big person God. This is not a human God. This is not a, hey, I have a hobby, I'd like to make human beings. It is a sense that there is this ultimate metaphysical truth of desire to create and evolve, to develop, to grow. And this is part of that essential instinct of the nature of the universal God. Now, that old concept is going to be really hard to get rid of, I can promise you. And so we keep falling back into it. But try to expand right now just into a sense of a not at all human and much less personal God that is in nature love and light and life, and which has an instinctive, natural propensity towards growth and development. Okay, so this is the basic model. It starts with the love story of creation, just like where did we come from, that there is this natural impulse of the Creator God to create out of love more beings that can experience the expansive cosmic nature. Okay, that's a whole thing in itself, which would take a lot of sort of working with and comfort with and experience with, so on and so forth, to fully accept, especially if you're used to a human God model. But this is now the vibrational evolution of human consciousness as a model for how human beings evolve. And the goal overall, so the big picture goal is that human beings have to separate from the great cosmic God in order to develop free will. So if God, being universal, if there is not enough separation, then free will is a meaningless concept, because the bigness and completeness of God, how could any part of God want something different than the whole God wants, right? So in order to be able to develop into a God being, a full, for lack of a better word, child of God, not just an extension of God, then the first thing we need is to develop a separate sense of self. Now, in some ways, this is an illusion, right? Now, this answers the question between, like, are we all part of God, or are we separate from God, right? The dualism question is like one of the oldest theological questions. This answers that in the sense that both is the answer, okay? We are actually never separated, but we have a sense of separation that comes with density. So when we enter from a unified divine consciousness state into a physical form, that density gives the illusion of separateness. And this illusion of separateness allows us to develop a sense of individuality and free will. So the lowest level of vibrational consciousness is individuality and survival, okay? That's really important. Now, I promise you, you will want to make this a hierarchy of goodness. That's because most of us spend a lot of time in good, bad consciousness, lower levels of good, bad consciousness. It's really natural. You're going to keep going back to it, but I promise you, this is not a hierarchy of goodness. This is development, and every part of it matters. That's why it says every vibrational state is perfectly designed to support our evolution. Every way of learning is good. Every level takes exactly as long as we need, okay? So this first state is really important. Now, it looks terrible in some ways. In individuality and survival consciousness, people are motivated only or primarily by the need to survive at all costs. There's really no sense of compassion or presence for other people, none of those things. So in this model, I'm kind of mixing the personal and the global. So there is the development of all human beings. We're all developing as a species, and then we're developing individually. So in this version of the model, there's kind of, it primarily is speaking from a sort of whole evolution. When you get into the personal steps, it's a little bit different how that's applied individually. So this is sort of the whole species relationship to ideas of God and of morality and spiritual development. So again, individuality, survival consciousness is very important. It's very dense, but this is the place where the sense of individuality gets built. Now, in the most dense state, there is a lack of sense of connection to anyone or anything. So nobody else matters. The suffering of anybody else doesn't matter, and so you do whatever it takes. There's no sense of something greater than us, no sense of grander meaning, purpose, God, none of it. From this place, we can be completely unremorsefully violent. That is why we look at it and we think it's bad, but it is incredibly important. It's valuable, okay? So there is no value judgment in this hierarchy except growth. Okay, so the only value attached to this is that we are designed to grow, that growth is the thing that matters, not where we are on the hierarchy, and we're never completely in one place, as we'll talk about a little bit later, but growth is the value here. If we're not moving and growing, then that could be a problem, but it's almost impossible not to. We can grow at different rates, and we can kind of resist growth or embrace growth, but growth is kind of inevitable because it is part of our design. We are part of the divine nature that is set to grow. Okay, so next level, punishment reward consciousness. So in this now, there's the first awareness of a sense of something bigger than ourselves, something beyond individuality. There's a sense of community, there's a sense of family, a sense of tribe often. So now there's like this expansion of self that goes out into other people where something other than my flesh survival may matter. And then also it can be a first sense of God, but God at this level, especially in the lower end, remember each of these levels is a spectrum. It's not like a singular thing. So in the lower levels of it, God is just a big human. So God is like me, which is moody and reactive and punishing and all that stuff, and has the same motivations as me, but just sort of more powerful, because the observation of human beings that like I don't control everything, but I do control some things. So if I control some stuff and then other stuff seems to be controlled but I'm not controlling it, then there must be a bigger version of me that controls it. That's like a really logical kind of leap in human development. So then there's gods that control the stuff. They control the wind or the waves or the sky or, weather or crops or fertility. All those kind of things develop in this. And the associated with that is a sense of reward. So if bad stuff happens and good stuff happens, then it must be the thing that's bigger than me is doling out rewards and punishments. That's how I work. When I like something, I reward those who give it to me, and when I don't like something, I want to punish those who give it to me. So the big beings that are in control must be doing the same thing, right? So the whole world is seen in context of reward and punishment, and there's an intense sense of righteousness attached to it. as it develops, it's into this good bad consciousness. Now there's a sense of morality that has compassion attached to it rather than just punishment focused. There's a great deal of longing. So this is to be good. There's this first sense that there's something that could be essentially good, not just more powerful or bigger, but good in a real felt sense moral way, like that this God or the universe or however one is conceiving it is that there's a goodness that is valuable, love and compassion, presence, kindness, that there is a real and essential value to goodness that is beyond reward and punishment. That good is good even if it's punished. And that doing harm, that there are things that are bad even if they are unpunished. And so that's good bad consciousness, and it's this, and it brings about a lot of anxiety. So there's actually a lot of angst that comes with this time too, because now there's a real felt sense of longing for good, and then an awareness that we're not good a lot of the time. We're not living up to that felt sense of the possibility of good. And so this is the first real guilt and grief at our failures and incapacity. And the good bad consciousness is a huge spectrum. It can go from just the beginning of developing compassion to a highly evolved effort to be selfless and loving and to do good. But it is still really accompanied by this grief at not good. Shame, fear, all these things come up in that. And then this devotion, service level of consciousness. Now people see this and they're like, oh, that's the good one, right? That's the really good one. We want to have that. But devotion service is really a lot about release of attachments, okay? So the effort to be good and the grief about not being good starts to dissolve because the good thing has been attached to ego structures, okay? So now the goal is, instead of trying to be good, the goal is now to release misunderstanding, to release attachments. The idea is I am already good. I am already God, right? But there are all these remnants and relics of misunderstanding in my development. So the goal is to release those. Now that's an idea people love, right? And there's so many people embracing this idea that I am already God and I'm already good. That's not this, because this level is not focused on the idea, it's focused on the action of it, which means I am purposefully and intentionally going into things that trigger my attachment in order to develop past them. So you'll see this in mystical saints and various places. Now it can get distorted, but the pure version of it is that basically I long for and seek out anything that triggers my attachments so that I can move past them. What triggers human attachments the most? Illness, sickness, incapacity, injustice, being misunderstood, being wronged, being violated, right? And so instead of avoiding all this pain, which is the natural inclination for all the other levels, instead of trying to avoid that pain, now there's an embracing of human suffering. Now, here's the tricky part of this. A lot of people have tried to do this from a good-bad consciousness level. Now, when I suffer, I'm good, so I want to suffer more. That is not a devotion service level consciousness. That is a good-bad consciousness, attaching itself to the ideals of devotion service level consciousness. In devotion service level consciousness, there's no effort to be good. There is no effort to get to have won something, have gotten something, have been recognized as good, or to achieve goodness. The goal is, I don't want anything to be between me and my ultimate nature. All these attachments are between me and my ultimate nature. And so I want to systematically dissolve them via embracing and accepting pain and all things that trigger my lower nature. This is really hard for people to understand. It's really beyond where our culture is at entirely. Like, it's entirely beyond where our culture is at. So it's really a concept that people have a hard time with. Even the higher levels of good, bad are sort of hard for people to get. But we will almost always sort of try to put ourselves in a higher category than we're typically functioning at, because we're so invested in this sense of good and bad. We want to be good. We want to attach ourselves to things that are good, right? We see them as good, and we want that to be us. So that's, it's really natural, and it's totally okay, and it's not really accurate. So if we're really working in devotion service consciousness, then there's no martyred energy in the sense of, oh, poor me, the negative martyr. There is like an actual love of, an embrace of the things that challenge us. And that's hard. Most of us aren't doing much in that area. And then there's this reunification, when all the attachments, when all the misunderstanding, when all the lower vibrational things have been released, then there's a reunification with the ultimate consciousness, God. But it is not, there is a dissolution here, but the uniqueness of our experience, the fullness of the completely unique human soul that you have evolved into, then when it dissolves into the great love and light and life, the great source, it is bringing a richness, a fullness. It is adding to and actually supporting the development of the great consciousness. Okay, so that's the model. Obviously, we're not yet unified with God or with ourselves. So now we're going to talk about the kind of nitty-gritty of how a human consciousness develops a little bit. Okay, so if you see the circle with all the little parts in it, if you think of that as self, small s self, the whole of our parts, we have lots of parts. We're not one, right? Human beings are not like, I'm not like one thing, and my consciousness is not one thing. We have different parts. Some parts are in different vibrational levels than other parts. So this is the image of that. There's our low end and our high end, is how I usually talk about it. So for example, if this is a person, then they have like 4 or 5 parts in the individuality, survival, whatever it is, 2, 4, 6, 8-ish parts in reward, punishment, and 4 parts in good, bad consciousness. And each of these needs to develop. Every part is trying to evolve. And so when we see ourselves as a whole, we're going to have all these different parts, which means we have different motivations, right? The lower vibrational parts are motivated by lower vibrational consciousness, and so on and so forth. So we have some options to how we work with this, but we need a toolkit to most effectively evolve. We will evolve naturally, even without any conscious evolution, without engaging consciously with the process. We will evolve. We evolve by trial and error. We evolve by experiencing things over and over and over again and learning from them naturally. But we have this capacity to then consciously evolve. So there's 2 levels of conscious evolution. and I contradict myself sometimes about this, because sometimes I'm talking about one, sometimes I'm talking about the other. The lower level of conscious evolution is just the awareness that we are growing and the desire to grow. The next level is actually embodiment of one's own soul nature, a knowledge of one's own soul, so that it moves from being guided from a mix of spiritual impulses and egoic impulses to having our behavior and decisions driven by our soul nature. So that changes the level of conscious evolution. It's really like submitting more and more of our decision making and movement to a soul level decision, which then makes a whole other kind of conscious evolution. Okay, so again, we are very, I would say that the human consciousness is varied all over the country. People are all over the world. People are doing different things. Different groups are sort of together in different conscious. But we have a group unconscious in the United States that tends toward the high end of punishment reward and the low end of good bad. That's kind of like the common denominator. It's the most typical. And if we're not making a conscious effort to do something different than that, we'll kind of slide into punishment, reward, the good, bad. We really want to associate ourselves. It's very natural to our egos to really want to identify with things that are good and not with things that are bad, but also have this really deep terror that we're essentially bad in some way, unlovable, unworthy, right? So the good, bad is a big part. And then when we're really triggered as a society, we tend to go right into punishment reward, like who are the bad guys, who are the good guys, who needs to be punished, who needs to be rewarded. And so that's the kind of group unconscious where we're at right now. Again, lower vibrations are not worse than higher. I know. Really want to go back into that, and you're going to find yourself doing that if you try to apply this model, so it's good to be aware of it. Every lesson, every level is essential. We cannot do the process without each of these levels. Just like there's nothing better about an 8-year-old than a 2-year-old. An 8-year-old is not a better human being than a 2-year-old, right? It's developmentally ahead, but it's not better. You have to be a 2-year-old. There's nothing wrong. 2-year-old is a very important step, and it gives very specific gifts that are essential to the development of the human being. It is growth that is valuable, and part of that is embracing the developmental levels that we're at when we're there. Okay, so what tends to happen is that we want to identify with certain parts of ourselves and not identify with other parts of ourselves. Once we're into good, bad consciousness, we have this feeling that all those things that are lower are bad and they should not be. And so then we build shame around it. Like, oh, I have these bad impulses. I have the impulse to survive at any cost, to step on people, to get ahead. I have the impulse to try to play God, to punish and reward people, to judge people harshly. All these, have all these destructive, violent impulses, right? And so when this first part gets up into good, bad, or this part from good, bad consciousness, it's going, that's bad. It's all bad. I need to get rid of it. That is not how we develop, though. What that does, like from Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, he talked about shadow, and that if we shove what we perceive as negative parts into our shadow and away from the light, away from capacity to be known, then they become powerful sabotagers, powerful self-destructive capacities. Instead, we need to become aware of, integrate, and evolve each piece. But that requires us to actually evolve our perception of them and move more into acceptance and willingness, which is what helps lift the good-bad consciousness. Now, I'm going to talk about judgment and trying to figure out where you're at and where other people are at in this next slide. So this is a tool and not a weapon. If you try to understand this, if you truly understand this model, you will never use it to diminish, demean, or reject another human being. You will want to, because that's our nature. We have parts of ourselves in those lower vibrational levels. We love to put ourselves above other people, to make other people bad, or at least us better. It's a really natural impulse. I'm not recommending that you reject this impulse and call it bad, but we can make a choice not to enact it and to counteract it when possible. Your judgments just won't function in this model, okay? It doesn't work, and I'll show you why it doesn't. Okay, so let's say this is a person. Look, they have parts up in devotion service level here. Their high end is has a lot of development. Their low end still is in survival and individuality consciousness. So this is a multi-lifetime model. This is a reincarnation model. So every life we're deciding to embrace and engage certain experiences, certain likelihoods of experience in order to learn and grow most effectively. So when we look around at other people, we can try to judge where they're at developmentally. We can be like, oh, this person is really reactive to other people. They're violent. They have trouble keeping jobs, being around other human beings, right? They're super defensive, not functioning very well. And we can go, oh, they're not very evolved. But that could be a complete misunderstanding for this reason. We can choose a life that is most likely to trigger our lowest developmental pieces. So these pieces down in the low end, right? And we can have the life be an immersion into those parts where the goal is just to lift that part up one step. So it may be that you choose a life that is so stacked against responsible, good-looking behavior in society, so filled with abuse and neglect and literal like attachment, brain damage, all this stuff that makes it so hard to do anything except individual survival, right? And it may be that your goal for that life is to not murder. And if that part can resist the impulse to actually kill other human beings, then you have actually done a huge step. You have brought up your low end in a dramatic way. Now another person, right? Same person with the same configuration, they may come in and they're really supposed to be focusing on a lot of good-bad consciousness development. But what they've decided to do is identify with their high end. And so they may look like a very healthy, kind, loving, they may run charities, or, they're doing all this lovely, externally good stuff. But they actually have spent the whole life avoiding dealing with their lower vibrational parts, and therefore they've made no progress in that life. So you can look at these two lives and say, oh, this is a really good life and this is a bad life, and this person is high vibrational conscious, this person is low vibrational conscious. But actually the person who looks like they're a mess may have done a huge step in their development in that life, and the person who looks like they have it all together may have done no development in that life. You don't know, and you cannot know. So the stance we take is, first of all, it's none of your business where other people are developing. Comparing yourself to them will never help you. And second, invest in your own work. That's where it matters. You're not good or bad. You're not less bad or more good because someone else is below you. That is a misunderstanding and addressing that misunderstanding rather than acting it out is the best thing you can do for yourself in your development. Like we said here. Okay, so why this model? I think there's a few reasons. One is it is the answer to 10,000 different questions, and I've tested this now. So I rolled this out about 7 years ago in our spiritual communities across the country, and integrated it with modern mystical teachings, metaphysics, and a specific spiritual development path that includes meditations and exercises and all this. I found that it is very helpful as a model, that it helps people understand themselves and understand the stages of their development and where we have pitfalls and what some of the solutions to those pitfalls are. It really is integrative. It does work with traditional scripture. It works with neuroscience. It works with quantum physics. It works with all these different realities and facts in the world. And it seems to really be pretty consistently reliable in the way that it's able to be applied. So it didn't come to me out of my mind and a desire to create logic, but I did have a need in my nature for the theological system to hold water, to be pretty internally consistent and applicable in a lot of different places. And it does do that. So this is a model. I'm offering it to the world. It will be in my upcoming book in much more detail. The book called The Mystical Millennium. And we'll get into some more detail about the sub-levels and some of the nuances of these developmental stages, and also how they're applied. So I hope this was interesting and engaging, and if you have questions about how to apply ideas in the model, feel free to put them in the comment section, and I will answer as many as I can. If you are just interested in trying to find holes and criticizing, I'm not really interested in engaging. Unless you have done a lot of work with yourself and with your own needs and motivations around these things, then it won't be useful to you. Just answering random criticisms won't help you, and it's a waste of my time. But if you have a real substantive question, then please do write it in the comments, and I'll try to get back to you. They're often very complex, but you can also, get some context for the metaphysical and hermetic aspects by doing the courses at Sophia Wisdom Centers in the Order of the Mystical Christ, because that's all the rest of the context for this model that then provides practical solutions and community. Okay, thank you, and goodbye.